Local people hated the psycho killer in this podcast so much they held a fireworks party outside Edinburgh Prison when he died. His name was Peter Tobin, and he was only unmasked as a serial killer when the body of his final victim was discovered hidden under the floorboards of a church in Glasgow.
Tobin was eventually convicted of 3 murders, but his arrest set in train a cold case investigation, Operation Anagram, that spanned 6 decades and linked Tobin to a notorious series of Scottish murders, the so-called Bible John killings.
How many women and girls did paedophile Peter Tobin really murder? And was he Bible John? It's time to head to the dark side. And be aware, this podcast contains graphic descriptions of murder and sexual offences. Angelika-Kluk was a bright-eyed, brown-haired student from Gdansk University in Poland. She'd spent the summer of 2006 working in Scotland to fund her language studies. On Sunday the 24th of September, the 23-year-old vanished without trace. 48 hours later, on Tuesday the 26th of September, her boyfriend raised the alarm. Strathclyde police officially declared Angelika a missing person and started making inquiries. She'd been working as a cleaner at St Patrick's Church in the Anderston district of Glasgow, and suspicion soon fell on 3 men, including a slightly built church handyman called Pat McLaughlin. Angelika had been helping McLaughlin paint a shed on the day she disappeared, and in the first instance, the 60-year-old was happy to help the police. He seemed fond of the student, calling her his wee apprentice. But within hours of being interviewed by detectives, McLaughlin also disappeared. Strathclyde police decided to release McLaughlin's picture to the media. Soon after it appeared on regional television, a woman rang the incident room. Her information was dynamite. Pat McLaughlin was in fact Peter Tobin, a convicted sex offender the authorities on both sides of the border had lost track of, and he'd been at large for almost a year.
Peter Tobin was jailed for 14 years in 1994 for the savage rape, buggery and sexual assault of 2 girls aged just 14 and 15. The trial judge at the time called it the worst I have ever come across. Tobin was living in the Hampshire town of Havant at the time of the attack, and he used his 6-year-old son, Daniel, to lure the 2 teenagers to his flat on the pretext of babysitting. Once inside, he threatened them with a knife and forced them to swallow anatriptyline, an antidepressant that can cause drowsiness and dizziness, washed down with strong cider and vodka. The teenagers lapsed into unconsciousness, and Tobin proceeded to rape, bugger, and sexually assault them. He stabbed one of them, but was interrupted when his son walked in. Caught in the act, Tobin calmly turned on the gas stove and, taking his young son with him, left the girls to either suffocate or die in a gas explosion. Miraculously, 5 hours later, one of them came round. Despite having her wrists and ankles tied, she struggled free and phoned 999.
Tobin went on the run, changing his name to Peter Wilson and joining a religious community in Coventry called the Jesus Fellowship. But when his photo appeared on the BBC's Crime Watch programme, the game was up. Other members of the community recognised his picture and alerted the authorities, and the police swooped. Peter Wilson, aka Peter Tobin, was taken before Winchester Crown Court, where he pleaded guilty. Sentencing Tobin, the trial judge said the child rapist had treated the girls as cruelly as a cat would treat a mouse. Tobin served 10 years of his 14-year sentence. On his release in May 2004, aged 58, he returned to Paisley in Scotland, near to where he grew up.
Peter Britton Tobin was born in Johnston near Glasgow on Tuesday the 27th of August 1946. He was the youngest of 8 children, with 4 brothers and 3 sisters. When he was just 7, he was sent to a reform school for disruptive children, and from there it was a downward spiral. A series of petty offences culminated in a minor conviction and a spell in Borstal, what we now call a young offenders institution. Tobin was a devil, and a handsome one at that. As a young man, he found work as a chef in Glasgow, and he liked to spend his weekends and evenings dancing, often frequenting a dance hall called the Barrowlands, a venue that features prominently later in our story. Tobin displayed a range of psychopathic traits, as identified by Professor Robert D. Hare in the 20-point revised psychopathy checklist. The 22-year-old was egocentric, he had no respect for the law, and was a pathological liar, especially when it came to impressing the girls. He lacked empathy and showed no conscience or sense of guilt. He also had a history of bullying and victimising other people.
It was at the Barrowlands that Tobin met the girl who would become his first wife. Margaret Mountney, a typist, was just 17, and Tobin, suave, dapper and 5 years older, swept her off her feet. At first he was a true romantic, taking her for long drives along the banks of Loch Lomond and introducing her to his elderly parents. Then the young couple moved into their first home, a rented flat in East Glasgow. Tobin quickly became violent. He forbade his fiancée to go to work or leave the flat at all, and then beat and raped her, often at knife point. He bought Margaret a puppy, but cut off its head in a fit of rage because it wouldn't stop yelping.
Animal cruelty and mutilation, a clear indication of what criminologists and psychologists call progression. Tobin's abusive psychopathic behaviour was escalating. Now, many infamous serial killers, including Ted Bundy, Gary Ridgway and John Wayne Gacy, started by abusing animals. In 1963, psychiatrist John MacDonald proposed what we now know as the MacDonald Triad, 3 behaviours in children which, he theorised, could predict whether a child would commit violent crimes in adulthood. Cruelty to animals is one element of the MacDonald Triad, the others are fire starting and bedwetting beyond the age of 5. But MacDonald's theory was revised following a review in 2018 which failed to find a history of all 3 behaviours among violent offenders. However, the presence of any one of the triad behaviours when isolated was associated with future aggression. The researchers concluded the triad could be used to identify a dysfunctional or abusive home environment or poor coping skills. So, is there a common factor in the making of a psychopath? Severe abuse during childhood is a recurring theme among the biographies of so many serial killers, but even though it is a significant commonality, most survivors of childhood abuse do not go on to commit murder. Remember, though, that most psychopaths aren't homicidal. They find a way of blending in, like social chameleons. They hide in plain sight. That was Peter Tobin, a Jekyll and Hyde personality, charming and attentive, but once he got his hooks into a victim, his true nature revealed itself.
The attacks on Margaret got worse. He began threatening her with the knife he'd used to kill the puppy. In the most horrifying incident, Tobin pushed the blade into Margaret's vagina, causing internal lacerations. Her life was saved by the downstairs neighbours, who saw blood dripping through the ceiling and rushed to help. Margaret survived despite massive blood loss, but she was never able to have children.
Margaret was terrified of Tobin, but was in his thrall. It seems inconceivable, but Margaret was like many other women who don't feel able to break free from a violent and abusive partner. I've seen a lot of it in my career, and I've heard lots of reasons too. Putting on a brave face and not wanting the stigma of a broken marriage, a lack of self-esteem and the fear of going it alone, family attitudes to be loyal to your man. Some feel it's their duty to try and tame the tiger. Some do nothing out of one simple emotion: fear of the consequences. Poor Margaret stood by him, and the couple moved to Brighton, 460 miles away on the south coast of England, where they married. It's hard to imagine what kind of ordeal Margaret endured at the hands of her coercive, controlling brute of a husband. 18 years old and at the mercy of Tobin, to all effects his slave. Her friends and family in Glasgow might as well have been on the moon. Luckily for Margaret, in 1970, and barely a year into their marriage, Tobin was jailed for offences including burglary and forgery. This gave her some time and space to reflect, and she used the opportunity to divorce him. What strength that must have taken, after 2 years of indoctrination and abuse, to finally break free from that monster.
But Tobin wasn't done with matrimony. In 1973, he married 30-year-old Sylvia Jeffries, a nurse from Brighton. The couple had a son and a daughter, but the baby girl died soon after birth. This second marriage lasted until 1976, when Sylvia left with their son. It was another 10 years before Tobin started a relationship in 1986 with Cathy Wilson, a 16-year-old girl who tagged along with the motorbike club of which Tobin was a member. Cathy had dropped out of school, had walked out on her grandparents, and needed a job to make ends meet. So when Tobin said he could find her employment at the hotel where he worked, Cathy jumped at the offer. But Tobin conned Cathy into trusting him. All too soon she was under Tobin's spell and in his bed. Tobin was 30 years older than Cathy. He manipulated the teenager into getting pregnant, and their son Daniel was born in 1987. Soon afterwards, the couple married. Then, out of the blue, Tobin announced they were moving from Brighton to Bathgate in West Lothian. It was the same uprooting that Margaret Mountney experienced, just in the opposite direction. Hundreds of miles from her family and friends, Cathy Wilson found herself at the mercy of her volatile psychopath of a husband. In 2021, she told the Sky documentary series The Murderer and Me about how Tobin kept her a prisoner in the house they shared.
As soon as he got me up there, he isolated me even further from everyone. I was only allowed one phone call a week to my grandparents, and he'd sit next to me on the sofa being attentive when I made the phone call, but actually in hindsight you can see it was so that he could monitor what I was saying, make sure I didn't say anything. Not that I would have dared to say anything inappropriate. I certainly was being fully now locked down in the property. I wasn't able to go out of the house except for the shops, and that was an accompanied visit. I really felt that I had to now leave this. There was nothing for me to stay for at all. And therefore, logically, I needed a divorce, because that's what you do when you're married.
Cathy waited until she thought the time was right before telling Tobin she wanted a divorce. And his reaction was terrifying.
The next thing I know, he's literally picked Daniel up from the landing next to him and dangled him over the staircase. And he said, "I'll drop your son if you ever leave me. I'll kill your son if you ever leave me." And I just saw Daniel there, and his eyes were scared, and the only job I have in my life is to protect him. And I'm screwing it up. So I said immediately, "You're right. It was a really, really silly idea. I don't know where I got that from. Put Daniel back." He then just changed, and everything was completely normal, as though he'd not just dangled his son above the staircase. And I'm grabbing my son as quickly as I can, and just shaking and calming myself down, and knowing then I'm never going to get away.
But Cathy did get away. Summoning all her courage, she waited until Tobin was out, put Daniel in his pushchair, and headed for the bus station. She moved back to Portsmouth in Hampshire, where she'd grown up. But Tobin was hot on her heels. He wanted a reconciliation, and if that wasn't possible, he insisted on seeing his son. He moved to Margate, Kent, and life returned to some semblance of normality. Then, in 1991, the bombshell dropped. Tobin kidnapped Daniel, took him back to Bathgate, and told Cathy that her only chance of seeing the boy again was to agree to live with him as his wife. Faced with the prospect of never seeing Daniel again, Kathy hatched a desperate plan to rescue the 4-year-old Daniel. She returned to Bathgate, to the house they'd shared, where she told the murderer and me Tobin subjected her to a brutal and degrading ordeal.
And for 3 days and nights, I had to do whatever it was that he wanted me to do to prove to him that I was going to be going back with him again, if he was to deign to move further south with me. And that involved very uncomfortable sex in very uncomfortable places, repeatedly, angrily. It was disgusting. He would want to perform in front of Daniel, who was obviously only a child, and that took me straight back to having my mother raped. He was giving my son the memories that I can't get rid of that were in my brain. But he did that because he was testing me to see if I was really prepared to give it a go. And I passed the test. It took me 3 days. Of hell, actually. 3 days of hell.
Kathy Wilson was prepared to sacrifice herself to save her son. She remains convinced that if she hadn't been the mother of Tobin's child, the psychopath would have had no qualms about killing her. But he didn't, and Kathy again seized the first opportunity to escape with Daniel across the border to England, where a court had granted her custody. Tobin pursued her, but with the law on his wife's side, he was forced to abide by strict access conditions. In 1993, Tobin moved to Havant in Hampshire so he could see more of Daniel. And it was here, at his flat in Lee Park, that Tobin drugged, raped and sodomized those 2 teenage girls, having used Daniel as bait.
September 2006, St Patrick's Church, Anderston, Glasgow. During a search of the church, an expert noticed an imperfection in the floor near the confessional, which exposed a hatch measuring 28 by 18 inches. It opened into a crawl space, where police found the body of Angelika-Kluk. A post-mortem examination revealed that she'd been bound and gagged, raped, beaten with a piece of wood, and stabbed in the chest 16 times. Forensic evidence suggested that Angelika was still alive when she was stuffed under those floorboards. The frenzied nature of the attack and the methodical cover-up suggested that suspect Peter Tobin wasn't a first-time offender. The SIO David Swindle told BBC Scotland, "When I saw the injuries on her, I thought, he has done this before. You don't get to that age and kill for the first time." The detective also had a hunch that the person responsible may have intended to move and bury the body. DNA recovered at the scene produced a match for Peter Tobin. His DNA had been kept on file since the conviction for the rape of those 2 girls in Hampshire in 1994. Tobin had been released early. He'd been out of jail for 2 years, and he had already evaded the authorities, and he'd set himself up under a false name when he murdered Angelika. Over the years, Tobin had used up to 40 aliases, including Peter Wilson, James Kelly, Paul Semple, John Tobin, Peter Probin. He used the name Pat McLaughlin when he became the mild-mannered handyman doing odd jobs around the church. It was of even more concern that Tobin was still out there.
After Angelika's murder, Tobin moved to London. On the 1st of October 2006, he went to the National Neurology Hospital in Queen Square under another false name, James Kelly. But a nurse recognised him from his mugshot on TV and alerted the hospital authorities, who in turn called the police. Tobin's bloody game of cat and mouse was over. When a police officer asked him to identify himself, the killer simply replied, "Peter Tobin, you've been looking for me."
Tobin was initially arrested for breaching the terms of the sex offenders register, which gave officers time to build a forensic case against him. His DNA was found on Angelika's body and at the murder scene in Glasgow, where detectives had called in a specialist forensics team led by forensic scientist Carol Weston. Weston started her career as a trainee with Strathclyde Police in 1998, having graduated with a first-class honours degree in biological sciences from Napier University and an MSc in forensic science from Strathclyde University. The 39-year-old insisted Angelika's body should not be moved. Samples had to be gathered while the body remained where it was. This was far from straightforward because a hefty wooden beam blocked access to the crawl space. The team decided against sawing through it. Instead, Carol Weston squeezed herself through the hole beside the body. She would make her examination lying beside Angelika's remains. Miss Weston told BBC Scotland, "The first thing we had to do was remove the items which were obscuring the body, which was a tarpaulin and a black bin bag with items in it. At first we were worried because they smelt so strongly of decomposing matter. We were worried there were perhaps other body parts or something else down there, biological. So I wanted to actually go under the floorboards, down beside the body, so I could get the maximum amount of forensic evidence." The examination was supposed to take 60 minutes. It was 3.5 hours before Carol Weston came out of that crawl space. The earth beneath Angelika's body was laid out in grids, removed and sieved in case there was something significant buried in the soil. Key exhibits were logged. Pathologists took intimate samples and found seminal fluid in Angelika's vagina, indicating that sex had taken place around the time she was murdered. The semen samples were run through the Scottish DNA database, which contains around 280,000 profiles, but there was no match. However, the English database would give the investigators the name of Tobin. Fingerprint evidence from the bin bag and tarpaulin around Angelika's body were also a match for Tobin.
In the garden of the church was a chair leg stained with the dead woman's blood. The forensic team found blood droplets in a spray pattern in the church garage. When Tobin was arrested in London, he was wearing a t-shirt which was stained on the lower front. The staining proved to be a mixture of his semen and cellular material matching Angelika-Kluk. Strathclyde Police had all the evidence they needed. In March 2007, Tobin stood trial at the High Court in Edinburgh and was found guilty 6 weeks later of raping and murdering Angelika. Judge Lord Menzies said Tobin should serve a minimum of 21 years, describing him as inhuman and an evil man. Given his age, it was likely Tobin would die behind bars. However, his conviction was just the beginning of a series of chilling discoveries. Nobody could have predicted what was to follow, or Tobin's capacity for evil.
Within days of Tobin's arrest for the rape and murder of Angelika-Kluk, Strathclyde Police began a confidential investigation into his past. Confidential because they feared any leaks to the media might prejudice the live investigation of the Kluk case. Given the weight of forensic evidence, it would have been a travesty for Tobin to walk free on a technicality, and the risk of irresponsible reporting or speculation while Tobin was awaiting trial was simply too great. Operation Anagram, as it was called, was stamped top secret. Led by Detective Superintendent David Swindle, the team's task was to chronicle the nomadic life of Peter Tobin, from his birth in Johnston, Renfrewshire in 1946 to his arrest for Angelika's murder. Why? Because the police had reason to believe Tobin was a serial killer. Everything came under the microscope, from the cars he drove to the jobs he did, his friends, acquaintances and close relationships. Operation Anagram was, in a way, like the Yorkshire Ripper investigation, except Strathclyde police had a prime suspect in custody, and computers were able to store, catalogue and analyse every scrap of information. As detectives slowly began to assemble the jigsaw of Peter Tobin's life, they discovered he had as many as 60 addresses and used up to 40 aliases. He also had no fewer than 38 mobile phone SIM cards. This wasn't a man leading a double life. This was a man with multiple identities, skilled at concealment and prone to violence. In other words, a textbook psychopath. Detectives interviewed Tobin's 3 ex-wives. Margaret Mountney, Sylvia Jeffreys, and Cathy Wilson's testimony was chilling and heartbreaking. Cathy Wilson had divorced Tobin in 1993 after he was jailed for those rapes in Havant, and she gave Operation Anagram vital clues, evidence that linked Tobin to the disappearance of a teenager in Bathgate near Falkirk, halfway between Glasgow and Edinburgh.
15-year-old Vicky-Hamilton was last seen on the 10th of February 1991 as she waited for a bus home. Tobin was believed to have left Bathgate for Margate in Kent, almost 500 miles away, a few weeks after the S4 student disappeared. In June 2007, Tobin's former house in Bathgate was searched in connection with the disappearance, and on the 21st of July 2007, Lothian and Borders Police released a statement that they had arrested, cautioned and charged a male in connection with the matter, and a report had been submitted to the Procurator Fiscal. They did not at this stage name Tobin as the suspect. Acting on information received, detectives from Operation Anagram excavated the garden of a house in Southsea near Portsmouth, where Tobin was believed to have lived shortly after leaving Bathgate. On the 14th of November 2007, Lothian and Borders Police confirmed that human remains found in the back garden of 50 Irvine Drive, a house in Margate occupied by Tobin in 1991, were those of Vicky-Hamilton. In November 2008, Tobin stood trial at the High Court in Dundee for Hamilton's murder. The jury heard how Vicky-Hamilton's life was taken in a barbaric act of unspeakable horror. Tobin denied the charge, his defence counsel arguing that the evidence against his client was circumstantial. But eyewitness testimony blew this defence out of the water. Plus, there was forensic evidence, DNA and fingerprints left on a dagger found in Tobin's former house, on Vicky-Hamilton's purse and on the sheeting used to wrap up her body. After a month-long trial, Tobin was convicted of Vicky's murder on the 2nd of December 2008. Sentencing Tobin to life imprisonment, the judge said, "You stand convicted of the truly evil abduction and murder of a vulnerable young girl in 1991, and thereafter of attempting to defeat the ends of justice in various ways over an extended period. Yet again, you have shown yourself to be unfit to live in a decent society. It's hard for me to convey the loathing and revulsion that ordinary people will feel for what you have done. I fix the minimum period which you must spend in custody at 30 years. Had it been open to me, I would have made that period run consecutive to the 21-year custodial period that you're already serving." 9 days later, Tobin announced he intended to challenge the verdict and overturn the sentence imposed. That appeal was dropped in March 2009.
Familial DNA was crucial in securing Tobin's murder conviction. Police found Vicky-Hamilton's purse in the Bathgate house. Tests returned a partial DNA match, not Tobin himself, but a very close relative. It was his son, Daniel. The little boy's DNA must have transferred to Vicky-Hamilton's purse while he was playing with it, presumably while she was in the house before Tobin murdered her. According to the police timeline, Tobin murdered Vicky in the days before Kathy went to Bathgate to rescue Daniel, the ordeal she described as 3 days of hell. The evidence led detectives to a chilling conclusion, as Kathy Wilson explained to Sky's The Murderer and Me documentary.
They were completely in the belief that she had been killed and was probably in a locked room in the house in Bathgate on the weekend that I went to Bathgate to get my son home. Could there be another level of depravity that this man can go to? You just think it can't get any worse, and then it just gets worse and worse. It's inconceivable that he had me in a property doing the things I was doing with a dead person in the property as well.
Justice had been seen to be done. Vicky-Hamilton's family had some degree of closure. But the Operation Anagram detectives continued to rake over Peter Tobin's sordid past, convinced he was responsible for more unsolved murders. And they were right.
UK policing was now held by the Holmes 2 computerised database, and this allowed the merging of investigations across police forces. There were several police forces involved in the operation, and they were investigating the possibility of Tobin's connection to dozens of murders and disappearances of teenage girls and young women. This much improved system, Holmes 2, was launched around 2002, and this was the time when I first started working on murder cases and major crime myself. Holmes 2 is a database that allows for an organised and methodical approach to investigations, and these operate from a major incident room, and they're operated in the same way across the country, so it allows that senior investigating officer to direct and control the course of the inquiry. It allows for the categories and priorities to reflect the direction of the investigation. It is staff intensive, particularly when everything is fully indexed, but in return, the system is instantly searchable, and it can be done remotely too. What's more, it embeds computer intelligence. Used properly, Holmes 2 gives back what detectives ask it to do.
One of the missing persons was 18-year-old Dinah-mcnicol, a sixth former from Tillingham in Essex. Dinah was last seen alive on the 5th of August 1991, hitchhiking home with a male friend from a music festival in Liphook, Hampshire. The pair accepted a lift from a male subject. The man dropped off Dinah's friend at the Reigate Services, junction 8 of the M25, and drove off with Dinah in the passenger seat. She was never seen again. However, after her disappearance, regular withdrawals were made from her building society account at cash machines in Hampshire and Sussex. This was out of character. Dinah's friends and family knew that she was saving the money for travelling and university. In late 2007, following new leads provided by Operation Anagram, Essex Police reopened the investigation into Dinah-mcnicol's disappearance. On the 16th of November 2007, a second body was found at 50 Irvine Drive in Margate, later confirmed by police to be that of the missing 18-year-old. The pathologist found traces of amitriptyline in her system, the same drug Tobin used to dope his 2 teenage victims in Havant in 1993. On the 1st of September 2008, the Crown Prosecution Service served a summons on Tobin's solicitors, accusing him of Dinah's murder. The new trial began in June 2009, but was postponed and the jury discharged in the following month after the judge ruled that Tobin was not fit to stand trial pending surgery for cancer. The case resumed on the 14th of December 2009 at Chelmsford Crown Court. On the 16th of December, after the defence had offered no evidence, it took the jury less than 15 minutes to find Tobin guilty of murdering Dinah-mcnicol, and the serial killer was handed his 3rd life sentence.
With each fresh revelation and each new conviction, speculation grew in both Scotland and England that Peter Tobin was responsible for many more murders. At one point, A fellow inmate claimed the paedophile, rapist and multiple murderer had boasted of killing 48 victims. But during visits from Operation Anagram investigators, Tobin kept his mouth firmly shut on the subject.
Is there any way that you can assist us in finding this girl now?
As I say, I've never met her.
By this stage, David Swindle had retired and handed the files over to a new SIO, but he told BBC Scotland he was convinced that Tobin knew more than he was letting on.
As far as I'm concerned, Peter Tobin is evil. He's pure evil. This is someone that had no respect for humanity.
Are you convinced there would be other crimes, other very serious crimes?
I have no doubt that Peter Tobin has killed other people. The problem with Peter Tobin is his victims were vulnerable at that time, and he had a propensity for burying victims, as he did with Dinah-mcnicol and Vicky-Hamilton. This is someone that has definitely killed other people. I have no doubt about it. This is a coward that has taken the secrets to the grave.
And there was one high-profile case with which Tobin was being associated by the media, an unsolved series of brutal murders from the late 1960s, a killing spree that terrified the city of Glasgow and which ended as abruptly as it had begun. These were the so-called Bible John murders, and the question was Peter Tobin Bible John?
Bible John was a serial killer believed to be responsible for the murders of 3 young women in Glasgow between 1968 and 1969. The killer became known as Bible John for repeatedly quoting from the Bible, specifically verses condemning fornication and adultery, information supplied by Jean Langford, the sister of the third and final victim, Helen Puttock. The evening before she was murdered, Thursday the 30th of October 1969, Helen and her sister were dancing at the Barrowland Ballroom. The Barrowland Ballroom was and still is a popular venue for dancing and live music. Here they met 2 men who were both called John, but who had very different personalities. Jean's dance partner said he was a slater who lived in the Castlemilk area of Glasgow, but the other John was reserved and didn't mention where he was from. After dancing for about an hour, all 4 headed home. John, the slater from Castlemilk, went to catch a bus at George Square. Jean, Helen and the other John hailed a taxi. Their first stop was Jean's home in Knightswood, a 20-minute drive from the Barrowland, and during this journey John explained that he was a teetotaler, repeatedly quoting from the Old Testament stories of Moses. As Jean Langford later told detectives, he referred to the Barrowland as an adulterous den of iniquity, and made no bones about the fact he disapproved of married women going there without their husbands. Jean got out on Kelso Street and watched as the taxi turned into Earl Street towards Helen's home in Scottstoun. It was the last time Jean saw her sister alive. The next day, Friday the 31st of October 1969, a man walking his dog found Helen's body beside a drain pipe in the back garden of her flat on Earl Street. The 29-year-old had been stripped partially naked, extensively beaten about the face before being raped, then strangled to death with one of her own stockings. Grass stains on the soles of her feet and shoes indicated that she'd engaged in a ferocious struggle with her killer. The contents of her handbag had been scattered close to her body, although the handbag itself was missing. A man's cufflink was found near the body. Helen had evidently at one point tried to scale a nearby railway embankment. There was also a deep bite mark on her upper right thigh. Helen had been menstruating at the time of her murder, and this was something she had in common with the previous 2 victims. They had also been menstruating. The first and second women in the series were Patricia Docker and Jemima MacDonald.
Patricia Docker was a nurse and a married mother of 1, although when she died she was living apart from her husband. On the 22nd of February 1968, also a Thursday, she went dancing, first at the Majestic on Hope Street and then at the Barrowland Ballroom, where it was over 25's night. Patricia's naked body was discovered the next morning in the doorway of a lock-up garage a few yards from her parents' home where she was staying. A post-mortem examination concluded she'd been savagely beaten and strangled to death with a strong ligature, probably a belt. The pathologist found no clear evidence of sexual assault, perhaps because she was menstruating at the time of her murder, but investigators concluded Patricia's killer punched and kicked her in the face before raping and strangling her. Door-to-door inquiries produced a witness who recalled hearing a female scream, "Leave me alone," the previous evening, but there was hardly any other evidence. One shoe was lying nearby, but Patricia's clothes were never found. Divers retrieved her handbag from the River Cart, and her watch was discovered in a nearby puddle, but that was all. Her heartbroken father identified Patricia's body before breaking the dreadful news to the rest of the family.
On Saturday the 16th of August 1969, a 32-year-old mother of three named Jemima MacDonald also went dancing at the Barrowland Ballroom. Jemima was a regular, and as usual, her sister Margaret O'Brien agreed to babysit to give Jemima a night off. During the evening, several people saw Jemima with a young, well-dressed, well-spoken man of slim build, aged between 25 and 35, and between 6 feet and 6 feet 2 inches tall. He had short, dark brown hair with fair streaks, probably spoke with a distinctive Glaswegian accent, and occasionally inserted biblical quotations into his conversation. Jemima was last seen leaving the Barrowland shortly after midnight on the 17th of August in the company of this individual, walking towards Main Street or Landrecy Street. About 20 to 1, Margaret O'Brien became concerned that her sister hadn't come home. As Sunday wore on, Margaret overheard children gossiping that they'd seen the body of a woman in a derelict tenement building on McKeith Street. On Monday morning, with still no sign of Jemima, Margaret steeled herself and went to McKeith Street in search of answers. There she discovered her sister's extensively battered body lying face down with her shoes and stockings lying beside her. A post-mortem examination concluded that Jemima had been raped and extensively beaten, particularly about the face, before she'd been strangled to death with one of her own stockings. Her murder had occurred approximately 30 hours before her body had been discovered. Unlike Patricia Docker, Jemima MacDonald's body was fully clothed, although her underwear had been torn and, like Docker, she had been menstruating at the time of her death. Police inquiries into Jemima's movements on the night of her murder produced several eyewitnesses who were able to accurately describe the man she'd been with at the Barrowland. Door-to-door inquiries on McKeith Street also produced a witness who remembered hearing a woman screaming on the evening of the murder, although this witness couldn't recall the exact time. Consequently, the police dismissed her information as of little use to their inquiry. Jack, do you think the murders of Patricia Docker, Jemima MacDonald and Helen Puttock were the work of the same man? And if so, could he have been stopped sooner, for example, after the first murder, that of Patricia Docker?
There are clearly some similarities in the MO, the modus operandi, and what witnesses said about the man they'd encountered at Barrowland's nightclub. Whilst keeping an open mind, I would say that each murder should certainly have been investigated jointly under the same SIO, and if possible the same incident room. But this was 1968. We've mentioned in earlier episodes how the police were more parochial in those days. We have also mentioned how the communication between the police and the media was often poorly managed. The last thing you'd want is for the tail to have been wagging the dog. The media interest in these cases would be huge and speculation rife. It is likely that information would be made public that shouldn't have been, and equally, opportunities missed to carefully share specific information with the public. We also know that at the time of the Bible John murders, Tobin was living in that rented flat in East Glasgow with Margaret. He'd even met her at Barrowlands. I just wonder, did the scope of those house-to-house inquiries include Tobin's flat? But in terms of the killer, of course he could have been stopped sooner. But that's not to criticise the investigation in any way. It's the reality of the limitations of how murders were investigated back then. Tactical decisions are made in good faith, but they don't all pay off.
At the end of August 1969, the police had a reasonable description of Jemima MacDonald's killer. And after the murder of Helen Puttock at the end of October, they had excellent intelligence, thanks to Helen's sister, Jean Langford. She described the man as being tall, slim and well-dressed, with reddish or fair hair rounded neatly at the back. He was aged between 25 and 30 and approximately 5 feet 10 inches in height. The individual had given his name as either John Templeton, John Sempleson or John Emerson, and he'd been polite and well-spoken. He frequently quoted from the Old Testament during the taxi journey, but there was no indication that he was Catholic or Protestant. Jean Langford told police it became increasingly clear while they were in the taxi that she was getting in the way. At one point, he explained the reason he refrained from consuming alcohol was due to his being conditioned by a strict parental attitude, before adding, "I don't drink at Hogmanay, I pray." He'd also alluded to his father's belief that dance halls were dens of iniquity, with any married woman who frequented these premises being adulterous by nature. Jean Langford had a remarkable memory. She recalled that John Templeton, Sempleson or Emerson wore a well-cut brown Reed and Taylor brand suit. He smoked Embassy cigarettes. He said he was familiar with several drinking premises in the Yoker district of Glasgow and had once worked in a laboratory. She described the distinct facial features of this man, like he had overlapping front teeth. Nevertheless, the bouncers at the Barrowland ballroom gave a different description. The man who left with Jean and Helen, they said, had been short with black hair. Jack, who would you have been inclined to believe? The bouncers or Jean Langford?
Witnesses to the same event will remember certain things differently, and they describe things differently too. Jean Langford spent a reasonable amount of time in the company of this man, and it is likely that she was asked about it within 24 hours of leaving Barrowlands, because her sister's death was discovered the following day. She is a significant witness for that reason, and if her account was freely given, and the interviewing officer used open questions, then her evidence is very strong. As far as the bouncers are concerned, they would have seen hundreds of people leaving Barrowlands that night. Assuming they were talking about Jean and Helen, they were describing a brief glimpse of an unknown man. The interview with them could also have been made several days later. Their description is therefore less reliable. I would be more interested in whether those bouncers had worked there for a long time and whether this man was familiar to them.
The last possible sighting of the suspect was in the small hours of Friday the 31st of October. Around 2 a.m, the driver and conductor on a night bus noticed a young man matching the description given by Langford getting off a bus at the junction of Dumbarton Road and Grey Street. He was in a particularly dishevelled state, with mud stains on his jacket and a livid red mark on his cheek just beneath one eye. Both witnesses also recalled him repeatedly tucking a short cuff of one sleeve up into his jacket. Remember, a man's cufflink was found beside Helen Puttock's body. The man was last seen walking towards the public ferry to cross the River Clyde to the south side of the city. So here's what we know. The murder victims were all young, brunette women between the ages of 25 and 32. They all met their murderer at the Barrowland Ballroom, a dance hall and music venue in Glasgow. The perpetrator has never been identified, and the case remains both unsolved and one of the most extensive manhunts in Scottish criminal history. It was also the first time in Scotland in which the Crown Office published a composite drawing of a murder suspect. The killer earned the name Bible John because he repeatedly quoted from the Bible, specifically to condemn any form of adultery while in the company of his final victim, Helen Puttock, and her sister, Jean Langford. In 1972, Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie, who led the Bible John investigation, went on the record saying, "It is quite incredible that this man has eluded us. I am positive this man comes from Glasgow or nearby. He is between 25 and 30, between 5 feet 10 inches and 6 feet tall, has light red hair, good features, blue-grey eyes, and a smart, modern appearance. I do not think he is a very religious man, but just has a normal, intelligent working knowledge of the Bible which he likes to air. There must be many people who know someone who looks like this artist's impression." Jack, it is incredible, isn't it, that nobody was arrested given the amount of information police had about Bible John?
Let's think about this. If it is the same man, he frequents the Barrowlands Ballroom, a large dance hall dating back to the 1930s. It's likely that he visited on other occasions too. He dances and chats to women. He comes across as smart and well-spoken. All the women are mothers, and they probably told him this in conversation. They would probably also say whether they were in a relationship, but not necessarily. Is it a coincidence that all 3 women were menstruating? Possibly, but if they'd all told him they were on their period, that would suggest to me that he'd been chatting them up and suggesting a sexual encounter. Otherwise, why would they tell him such personal information? On one occasion, but possibly on each, he claims to be religious and against adultery. Was this a ploy to gain their trust and confidence for him to escort them safely home, that he was of good morals? Having escorted them close to home, he makes his assault on them. Whether this involved a romantic encounter or not, the fact that they may have fallen for his charm and allowed him to escort them home may have been enough for him to assume that they were being unfaithful to their partners. It gave him the opportunity too. The issue for the police, though, is how do they find women who may have encountered him in similar circumstances? Society was different back then. People generally married at a younger age, and they were more likely to stay in a marriage that wasn't really working out. Those women who'd encountered Bible John would probably be reluctant to admit to it, knowing it would cause tension in their relationship. Their partners may not even have been aware that they were going out to nightclubs. In addition to the public appeals in the media, maybe a more discreet appeal targeting young mothers in Glasgow could have been made.
Several criminologists and investigators have speculated that convicted serial killer Peter Tobin may have been Bible John. As we've heard, Tobin was convicted in May 2007 of the 2006 murder of Polish student Angelika-Kluk, who was raped, beaten and then stabbed to death. Tobin moved from Glasgow to England in August 1969 after murdering his fiancée, Margaret Mountney. Coincidentally, the couple met at the Barrowland Ballroom in 1968. Tobin lived in Brighton for 20 years from August 1969, so he was on the south coast of England at the time of the second and third Bible John killings. Later, Tobin moved between the south of England and Scotland. The fact that Tobin attacked Angelika-Kluk so ferociously, hid her body and then absconded to London prior to his arrest, as well as the methods of violence perpetrated on the 2 1991 victims unearthed in the garden of his home in Margate, did not suggest the work of a first-time killer. However, Bible John displayed his victims' bodies in public places. Tobin buried his known victims. Looking at the 1969 composite drawing of Bible John, there are some similarities with Peter Tobin when he was a young man. However, the composite shows Bible John with red hair, whereas contemporary photographs of Tobin show that his hair was darker. But it's not, I suppose, unknown for a man to change his appearance by dyeing his hair.
Then there's the evidence of Tobin's 3 ex-wives, who have all given accounts of being repeatedly imprisoned, throttled, beaten and raped by him, and each has stated that he was driven to extreme physical violence by the female menstrual cycle, a factor long suspected by investigators as being the perpetrator's actual motive behind the murders. In addition, Tobin is known to have been a staunch Roman Catholic with strong religious views. The alias Bible John may have given to Jean Langford and Helen Puttock in 1969 was John Semple, similar to one of the pseudonyms Tobin is known to have used. David Wilson, Professor Emeritus of Criminology and the founding director of the Centre for Applied Criminology at Birmingham City University, investigated Tobin's case for 3 years. He strongly believes the available evidence supports his theory that Tobin was Bible John. Professor Wilson became convinced that Tobin was Bible John during Tobin's trial for the 1991 murder of 18-year-old Dinah-mcnicol. Wilson noted similarities between the testimony of an acquaintance of McNicol's who'd been with her on the evening of her abduction and the taxi conversation between Bible John and Jean Langford. 1. Both men mentioned they did not drink at Hogmanay, and 2. They both claimed to have a cousin who'd once scored a hole-in-one at a golf match. Based on this, in 2010, Professor Wilson told the Daily Record newspaper, "I didn't set out to prove Tobin was Bible John, but I would stake my professional reputation on it." In the same interview, Wilson accepted there may never be definitive proof that Tobin was the infamous serial killer, but he added, "I am as convinced as it's able to be. As far as I am concerned, the case is closed." David Wilson published a book in the same year, The Lost British Serial Killer, co-written with Paul Harrison, a retired police officer. Jack, as circumstantial evidence goes, you've got to admit, that's one hell of a coincidence. In fact, as James Bond would say, once is unfortunate, twice is a coincidence, and 3 times is enemy action.
Those comments certainly stand out, but they are not that remarkable. I guess the golf line would be significant if there was a cousin of Tobin's who'd had a hole-in-one. But bravado in chat-up lines can be quite predictable. And they feature, don't they, in conversations and bars and nightclubs up and down the country.
In the end, Operation Anagram concluded Tobin was not Bible John. Firstly, he'd left Scotland and was living in Brighton before the 1969 murders of Jemima MacDonald and Helen Puttock. In fact, according to the marriage certificate, he wed Margaret Mountney in Brighton on the 6th of August 1969, 10 days before the murder of Jemima MacDonald. Tobin's ex-wife has since testified that they were still on honeymoon in Brighton at the time of the murder, and she insists he was with her at the time. Second, Tobin was in police custody for an unrelated offence when another of the killings occurred. He was in Brighton at the time of the 3rd murder, meaning he would have had to travel without his wife's knowledge to Glasgow and back from Brighton to have committed the murder of Helen Puttock. Thirdly, under the Operation Anagram investigation, Peter Tobin's DNA was checked against the semen left by Bible John. The results of this analysis conclusively proved the bodily fluid did not come from Tobin. And dental analysis showed that the deep bite on Helen Puttock's thigh was not made by Tobin. The same dental cross-checks eliminated John McInnes, another Bible John suspect, when his body was exhumed for examination in 1996.
DNA doesn't lie, and David Swindle, Operation Anagram's SIO, he's ruled out a link between Tobin and the Bible John murders. According to an article in the Daily Record newspaper, Swindle presided over the 2002 review of the Bible John murders 4 years before Tobin's arrest for the murder of Angelika-Kluk.
You have to wonder how badly the physical samples from 1968 and 1969 had deteriorated in storage. How do you think they may have been kept, Jack? And could reliable DNA evidence be extracted?
It could well be an issue. Items were packaged and stored differently then. Not only could they have deteriorated, they could lose their integrity and be susceptible to contamination. I recall that some items from the Stephen Lawrence murder inquiry were subsequently deemed unreliable due to the deterioration of the packaging, where those brown paper bags that had been sealed with sellotape had degraded, and that was from 1993. I also know from experience that historic cases are reviewed several times, and items subjected to forensic testing more than once. That too can cause deterioration of an item, such as a small piece of paper tissue, for example. Like in all investigations, you need to rely on luck sometimes that those exhibits survive intact.
Although Professor David Wilson claimed in his 2010 book, The Lost British Serial Killer, that Bible John was Peter Tobin, his co-author Paul Harrison later wrote back on those claims. In 2013, following the conclusion of Operation Anagram and the elimination of Peter Tobin as a suspect, Paul Harrison published a new book in which he claimed Bible John was a police officer. In Dancing with the Devil, Harrison claims the man in charge of the Bible John investigation in the 1960s, Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie, came to believe the killer was a colleague, but police chiefs told him to forget that line of inquiry. Beattie never named the officer he suspected, but Harrison claims to have been able to identify him through further research. He believes that he was given early retirement, pensioned off on health grounds, and has traced him to a home in the Scottish Highlands. Harrison claims that the man he's identified may even have killed again, but he stops short of naming him, citing legal reasons. In 2013, Harrison told the Daily Record newspaper, "I had the privilege of getting to know Joe Beattie very well. Over a period of years, he shared his thoughts on the case. Bible John haunted him until the day he died in 2000. Harrison said that Helen Puttock's sister, Jean McLachlan, who shared a taxi with the killer, was also convinced Bible John was a police officer. She was adamant she saw him show a warrant card to her sister before they left the dance hall," Harrison told the Daily Record. Beattie showed her his own warrant card, and Jeannie said it was identical to the one Bible John had shown her sister. The man who was with Jeannie that night, known only as Castle Milk John, also told her he suspected Helen's beau was an undercover cop. Perhaps that's why he didn't get into their taxi and why he's never come forward. This might have sounded far-fetched until the Wayne Couzens case exposed a serving police officer as a killer who abused his position of trust to lull victims into a false sense of security. And Ted Bundy impersonated authority figures, including posing as a police officer when he abducted Carol Durant in 1974.
In the summer of 2011, Strathclyde Police announced that Operation Anagram was being scaled back. Over 11 years, police managed to piece together a timeline of Tobin's movements and relationships over the decades. It helped convict him of the murders of 18-year-old dinah-mcnicol and 15-year-old Vicky-Hamilton, and the BBC's Crime Watch programme disclosed that 7 women whom Tobin raped were identified following an appeal for information in July 2010.
And tonight, 40 years on, Tobin's earliest known victim reveals how she survived her terrifying ordeal.
The next thing I remember is I woke up in this tenement and I was fighting for my life.
As a convicted paedophile, rapist and multiple murderer, Peter Tobin didn't have an easy time in HMP Edinburgh. He was kept apart from the other prisoners for his own safety, but the authorities couldn't watch him the whole time, and in 2015 he was hospitalised after another inmate slashed him. By this stage, Tobin was no stranger to hospital, where he was being treated for cancer. He was reportedly taken to the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh on Wednesday the 5th of October 2022, where he died. His death being formally announced to the media on Saturday the 8th. He was 76 years old. Among those who'd pleaded with the psychopath to come clean about his other supposed victims was his son, Daniel Wilson, who hadn't seen his father since he was 5. In an exclusive interview with the Daily Record newspaper, Daniel revealed he'd written to his estranged father on his deathbed. He told his father, "If you have a shred of humanity or mercy left in your soul, please confess now. You can stop this. It would save the families being dragged through everything, the courts, the suffering, the constant waiting. I'm always going to have the hassle of being your son, but this would spare everyone else the trouble. If it's notoriety you're after, you've got it. You should come clean now and save everyone else the pain. Look at it logically. There's no point in saying you're not guilty. You're not going to get out of prison. You may as well get it done with. It would help the families so much." But Tobin, a psychopath to the last, took those secrets with him to the grave.
One of the women Tobin is suspected of murdering was art student Jessie Earle. The 22-year-old disappeared from her bedsit in Eastbourne in 1980, and her remains were found in undergrowth at Beachy Head 9 years later. The coroner at the time recorded an open verdict on the grounds there was insufficient evidence Jessie had been murdered. This was despite the fact that she'd been found with her bra tied around her wrists and without any of her other clothes or belongings. Campaigners, among them criminologist Professor David Wilson, argue that Tobin could have been Jessie's killer. Why? Well, Tobin was reportedly in Eastbourne at the time of her disappearance. Jessie had told her family that she was worried about a married man she'd met. They were both associated by their connections to a local church. And when Jessie's body was discovered in 1989, Tobin suddenly moved away from Eastbourne. So, in May 2022, a new inquest was held, at which the East Sussex coroner ruled that Jessie had indeed been murdered. But was Tobin responsible? That we'll never know.
When the news of Tobin's death broke, Cathy Wilson told the media she was glad her ex-husband was dead. She told the Sunday Mirror, "He was a monster, and there is a feeling of relief that he is now dead." Nobody claimed the body of the murderer, rapist and paedophile, so on Thursday the 13th of October 2022, Peter Tobin's mortal remains were cremated. The ashes were scattered at sea, the same end as another notorious Scottish psychopath, Robert Black, who's the subject of another psycho killer true crime podcast.
So, what now? Where do the families of those Peter Tobin is suspected of murdering turn for justice or closure? You can be sure we'll keep monitoring developments and turning over those stones, because the truth, as someone once said, is out there.
Thanks for listening. Cathy Wilson was interviewed for The Murderer and Me, a Sky original documentary produced by Snack & Co. in 2021. John Swindle was speaking to BBC Scotland after the announcement of Peter Tobin's death, and the episode of Crime Watch appealing for Tobin's other victims to come forward aired on the BBC in 2010.
So often we see women murdered by controlling, coercive men, husbands, boyfriends, partners, the people closest to them who commit the ultimate betrayal of trust. The brave ones, you could say the lucky ones, like Cathy Wilson, escape and rebuild their lives, but the mental and physical scars stay with them for life. That's why we've decided to name Refuge as our adopted charity for 2023. Refuge is the largest domestic abuse organisation in the UK. On any given day, their services support thousands of women and their children, helping them to rebuild their lives free from fear. We've put the details of how you can donate on our website, psycho-killer.co. That's psycho-killer.co. So until next time, it's goodbye from me, Pip Watts.
From me, Jacques Morrell.
And from me, Simon Ford. Stay safe until we meet again for another unique Psycho Killer true crime podcast.